My name is Bianca Mageni. I'm here representing the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which is an organization that challenges unjust foreign policy measures and aims to bridge the gap between the perception and reality of Canada's role in the world. The CFPI also works to oppose the racism embedded in Canadian foreign policy. Should Canada continue to be a part of NATO or instead pursue non-military paths to power in the world? If we're serious about having a foreign policy that's based on peace, human rights, and overcoming global inequities, the answer is clear. NATO is the alliance to which Canada has devoted perhaps 90% of its military efforts since 1949. 72 years ago to tomorrow, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization officially came into existence. And two of the main reasons for establishing NATO, in a nutshell, weakening left-wing forces in post-war Europe and strengthening the US empire. So to maintain their colonies, European powers increasingly depended upon the North American diplomatic and financial assistance.
2 years ago, on March 19th, 2011, member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, began an aerial bombardment of the North African nation, Libya. The end result was a death toll of an estimated 50,000 people, the murder of that country's president, and a humanitarian crisis which includes slavery and the deaths of migrants using Libya as an embarkation point for Europe. 10 years later, Libya is in the midst of a civil war and still has no functioning government. This is but one example of the dangers of NATO, which is little more than a cartel carrying out acts of aggression around the world. NATO is the primary tool of the Atlanticist hegemon and therefore poses a great danger.
Since 2014, NATO obliges member states to further increase military budgets and investments. So everybody knows probably that all countries should spend, according to NATO, 2% of their BBP on defense, and 20% of their military budgets should be used for military investments. So in other words, NATO prevents individual member states from choosing disarmament, denuclearization, political dialogue, and common and cooperative security. It ignores the root causes of conflict and chooses militaristic approaches without even considering its own role in creating insecurity. In fact, it's the most important insecurity organization in the world. Just an example, NATO member states are responsible for 2/3 of the global arms trade, with warring countries such as Saudi Arabia as top destinations. Or the war in Iraq 2003 and Libya 2011 caused regional instability in the Middle East and the Sahel and created the breeding ground for extremist armed groups. NATO 2030 will be translated, as I said, in a new security doctrine to be endorsed in the next NATO summit in Brussels later this year. It's a recipe for encouraging a new Cold War 2.0. Arms race and more wars. NATO is an instrument of the military-industrial complex endangering human security and a just and peaceful world.
Now, to become a member of the alliance, countries have to meet certain political, economic, and military conditions. They have to move towards a free market economy, and they have to modernize their militaries to be interoperable with NATO allies. This is why US weapons manufacturers love NATO. It's a guaranteed market for their weapons. This is why Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics are big funders of the NATO Association of Canada, which has its office in Toronto. The NATO Association of Canada is the propaganda arm of the alliance in this country. Now think about this. In 2011, it was a Canadian Lieutenant General, Charles Bouchard, who led the NATO bombing of Libya. 2 years after he retired, Bouchard became head of Lockheed Martin Canada. Lockheed and other US weapons manufacturers spend a lot of money to hire lobbyists and consultants in this country to secure lucrative defense contracts and keep military spending high. So no wonder now Canada has a competition to buy 88 new fighter jets for a life cycle cost of $77 billion. And Canada is in the process of building 15 warships for a life cycle cost of $268 billion. And 2 years ago, the Liberal government gave a sole source contract to General Dynamics to build new tanks for $3 billion. Right now, Canada is training Iraqi police as part of a NATO operation, which is helping the United States occupy Iraq. Canada has 540 soldiers in Latvia leading a NATO battle group. Canada has fighter jets in Romania and warships in the Mediterranean and Black Sea on NATO operations. Right now, Canada is leading a NATO maritime group. But by contrast, Canada only has 42 soldiers on UN peacekeeping missions. Canada is not a peacekeeping country. Because of NATO, we are a war-making country. These weapon systems, though, are extremely carbon intensive. This is why I have argued that NATO is one of the greatest threats to the climate and one of the biggest obstacles to the Paris Agreement. NATO's so-called rules-based order undermines international law, so it is an imperative for us to build a national resistance to NATO. We need to delegitimize the alliance. We need to change the political and public discourse in this country that says that NATO provides security. NATO has proven in this pandemic that it is totally useless to meet the real human security challenges that we're facing, and it is exacerbating the climate crisis.
The expansion of the European Union and NATO has created a situation in which essentially this institutionalized West has moved eastwards up until Russia's borders and then drawn a line and divided the European continent into two, Europe and Russia, and created a situation in which Russia cannot be part of Europe. This therefore removes any of those incentives which previously existed for people within Russia to be part of the West. There's no reason for them to reform themselves to abide by what we would call Western norms, because they're not going to be accepted into the club regardless. The idea that NATO is a defensive alliance is not one that anyone but a handful of Russians would take seriously. Okay, Canada has sent troops 6,500 miles to Russia's border. Russia has not sent any troops 6,500 kilometers to our border. So from a Russian perspective, who is threatening who?
Yes, Canada should leave NATO. Everyone should leave NATO because the very structure is necessary only to accomplish evil ends.
So if you want to take further action, you can check out the No to Fighter Jets campaign, link right here. Also, you can pressure politicians to sign a UN nuclear ban treaty here. And also make sure to check out the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute website for upcoming panel discussions and other events. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel, Propa-Ganada Show, and stay tuned for upcoming episodes and interviews. Thanks a lot.